I'm entering into this kind of a dialogue after a long gap of maybe more than 20 years. But the only thing that really impresses me is that nothing much has changed. It is the same tactics, same tricks, same arguments, and same basic objective of the trade negotiations, which is continuing with added force. The only thing that surprises is that despite this repetition, this repeated experience, the government's attitude don't much change. In fact, more or less, governments walk into the trap laid for them and then try to work out some marginal escapes from the things closing in on. This has happened before, this has happened again, and the latest, of course, was the 12th MC that we had recently, and not only in agriculture, but also on the e-commerce and all the intellectual property. We have seen how even the initiatives taken by the government and pursued over time have been more or less quietly given up, with the result that we are at a place where we are worse off than where we were a few years ago. And this is the kind of situation we are facing in trade negotiations. Now, this has happened before, as I said, but there is one difference. For example, when the Uruguay round took place and the WTO came into being, that itself was a tremendous, at the cost of the prospect of development and welfare of the entire developing world. But at that time, perhaps there wasn't much option, in the sense, if you look at the situation, late 80s and then 90s, 95, WTO came into being, and the world was actually being led by the Western capitalist powers, and there was hardly any alternative available. And in that situation, perhaps the kind of map laid out that had to be followed. There was not much option. And of course, the national governments also thought that their welfare and their interest lies if they follow that path. Whatever that may be, the situation was more or less with little options. Today's situation is quite different. And I think when we look at the situation, we must make this distinction, we must keep clearly in our mind. The international order based on the dollar supremacy and led by the Western capitalist powers, particularly the USA and EU, that has suffered three crises. The first one was the 2008, which we know about. Then came the pandemic, and then has come the Ukraine crisis. Now, each one has affected fundamentally the very givens of the order in which we are living. It so happens that in the WTO, they try to forget these changing circumstances, and they try to work on the same old rails and the same old assumptions. I think time has come when we should think really in terms of more basic alternative to the kind of situation we are facing, the kind of problems we are facing in the international market and trade, and work out solutions which will be more in tune with what we need. And when we say we need, not only us, but a large number of countries like ours. Now, if you look at even if you look at the proceedings of the first meeting of the Agriculture Committee after the 12th MC, I saw it in the TWN news report. If you look at the reactions which are coming, you will find that a large number of countries have expressed a view very clearly that the kind of agricultural agreement we have and the kind of situation that we are facing, we have to think in terms of something new. And China has made observations on that. The African Caribbean countries have made observations on that. Indonesia and the G30 have made observations. All of them are quite convinced that this is not the thing which is going to solve our problem. And in India particularly, if you look at the situation of agrarian situation in India and the continuing agrarian crisis in India, there is no way that the system that the agricultural agreement imposes on us will have any solution for our problem. We have to have much vaster degree in terms of incomes, pricing, trade policies regarding agriculture. There is no way that you can have an agricultural production and trade policy which is totally linked to the kind of considerations of the agribusiness of the world. If you do that, you have no future for Indian agriculture. And it's not a question of writing or arguing about it. It's a question of plain, pure political fact. You can't have a country in which you have more than 50% of the workforce dependent on agrarian economy, a country in which even now about 15% of the GDP comes from the agricultural sector. Now that country you cannot compare with the countries in which it is less than it is a single digit contribution to GDP from agriculture, single digit dependence on the workforce for employment in agriculture. They are two different worlds altogether. And this is a fact which we have been emphasizing academically or in terms of arguments, etc., all along. But the fact of the matter is today it has taken a shape in which it has become a political compulsion. Why is it that you found that the three farm laws had to be repealed? They had to be repealed not because we had given good arguments, right, starting from the Uruguay round. That happened because the agrarian crisis is a fact of life. And that fact of life has impinged on the political reality in India. And therefore, the three laws which were really intended in order to integrate the Indian agricultural production and trade pattern with the entire world pattern of agribusiness, they had to be suspended. Now, this is not because we gave good arguments. This is because of political compulsion. And that political compulsion is reasserting itself when it comes to what we are talking about, the PSH, etc., etc. Now, the world situation is quite different than what it was when the WTO came into being. The international kind of a dollar supremacy and the seamless world of the transactions, financial and trade transactions across the globe, all that is a matter of past. Whatever may happen, whatever way the Ukraine crisis may end, the old order is not going to come back. And therefore, when we look upon our agrarian, in terms of agricultural agreement and what stand we should take, etc., we must start with this basic given, namely, the world is not the same. And then it's not only because we are relating it to these developments. You see what has happened to the WTO itself. The very the crux of the entire WTO when it was set up was the dispute settlement system. That dispute settlement system is virtually non-functioning. And you find that the entire lot of, and the Vishwajit and Shalini and others, you know it far better. You have been pursuing it for years. You know, the whole system of WTO has been more or less replaced or substituted by all kinds of free trade agreements and regional cooperation agreements and all kinds of things. Now, whether they are WTO plus, etc., is a different matter. But the fact of the matter is, WTO in its entire history of last 30 years is at its weakest phase. It has lost its credibility because the dispute settlement thing is not working. It has lost its credibility because there are many things which are happening which it cannot control. And then it is trying to somehow using its own powers and trying to use other than the trade and other powers in order to make people fall in line. In fact, the pity is that the commerce ministries and commerce ministers equate the nitty-gritty trade issues and the self-interest of the countries with the strategic interest. The EU and US never do that. Our commerce ministries are in the habit of doing it because if they do it, they can present a picture to political leadership that everything is fine on the Western front. And they don't assert. That is why on the PSH, we had this kind of pusillanimous stand taken by the government in the MC12. That is why we kept quiet about the e-commerce. That is why we, the third issue also, we didn't take any stand. This happens because we mistake trade issues are trade issues. There we must have adroit policy of pursuing national interests. And in fact, this government itself has followed that adroit policy of pursuing trade and commercial interests in its own interests. Like when it came to question of import of Russian oil or import of Russian fertilizers, we said we'll do it. And then nothing could stop them from doing it. This is the kind of adroit policy that we have to pursue when it comes to fighting for the trade issues. But as I said, now the trade matters, particularly relating to agriculture, have reached a stage where really the kind of discipline that we would have in the entire world, because certainly there will be a discipline, because there is an interlinkage of trade, investment, much more than what it was even 30 years before. And therefore, we'll need a kind of a discipline. But that discipline will be based on, not on the agribusiness interests, not on this kind of textbook maximization of trade benefits, but on the complementarities, on the cooperation, and a large degree of autonomy in policies regarding pricing, regarding trade, particularly in regard to agriculture. And unless we have that, we'll not have any discipline which will work. They will have meetings, they will have things, but then, as India did, we will not export, period. You can have a number of statements in Geneva criticizing us, but the fact of the matter is we will not export because we can't afford to do it. So the basic national interests, they will decide what kind of a stance we take. And there, as I said, while these basic interests will determine the stand of each particular participants in international negotiations, there will be a common denominator, particularly when it comes to agriculture. And the large areas of the world which are still under the peasant kind of a agriculture, they will need subsistence kind of farming. They will need a kind of a discipline which affords, which permits a large degree of freedom to the national governments. And this is precisely, after all, the kind of 3 laws that the government had to repeal. That is because that was impinging on the kind of space of autonomy that we have in policies in regard to agricultural trade and production. And therefore, I think the government must have learned its own lessons after that. And particularly, the question of MSP, as Raja rightly said, and Vishwajit also pointed out, MSP is the basic issue. That is not going, you can't just put it under the bushel and forget about it. It is going to come back and it's going to assert itself. Now, you can't have MSP system in India unless we move away from the agricultural discipline that we have. It is just not consistent. And therefore, we need to renegotiate. And that renegotiation will be in terms of a different kind of principles that will be based not on the agricultural, the agribusiness requirements, not on the kinds of textbook concepts of comparative advantage, but in terms of the what is needed to be done in order to get over the basic agrarian problem in a large number of developing countries. And there, the basic principle will be a large degree of autonomy in matters of pricing, trade, etc. The cooperation being the principle rather than competition in terms of the trade linkages. And thirdly, the food security and food sovereignty. That should be a basic consideration. This consideration will reassert itself again and again. As I said, the old world is not going to return. And you will find many other countries, including countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, countries like Russia, countries like China, they will find it different kind of, they will find it quite appropriate to think in terms of this. It requires a kind of a fresh approach. It requires a fresh look. It requires, on the one hand, we have to free ourselves from the entire inherited thinking in terms of agribusiness and competition and trade and that kind of a concept. And on the other, we have to think in terms of agrarian economy is not like any other economy. Agrarian economy, particularly in the kind of country that we have in a large number of developing countries, is the very basis of our entire existence. And that existence cannot be challenged. However people may want to do it, they will not be able to do it. This is a given political fact. And therefore, we have to, if we have to think anew, we have to think in terms of a new initiative on agricultural production and trade discipline, which is quite different from what we have been witnessing for the last 30 years. And as I said, the basic elements of those will be a large degree of autonomy, cooperation as the basic principle, and the cooperation and the food security and food sovereignty. These will be the basic principles. In fact, I'm not the only maverick thinking about this. I found that the rapporteur of the FAO on the food rights, he has also written, I was quite pleasantly surprised that he wrote a piece asking about winding down the agricultural agreement. And he has also, from the food, the right to food angle, how this agricultural agreement has not only failed, but is going in the opposite direction. And therefore, it has to be wound down. I think when we think in terms of working in a forum like ours, and many of you have given so much time and they know so much about it, I think we have to really yoke our thinking to a different kind of a thing now, a different objective. And it's not just merely providing technical inputs to negotiators. It's providing really alternative negotiating goals, alternative formations that we have. And I'm not talking something dreamy. You know, when the Uruguay round was in progress and we knew it was going to hurt us permanently and permanent damage it would make, we had taken an initiative at that time to set up what we called the GSTP, General System of Trade Preferences among Developing Countries. That was for the first time an instrument was negotiated, evolved, and finalized. First meeting was held in Delhi, then second meeting was held in Brazil, and the third meeting was held in Yugoslavia, when we adopted that. And all the developing countries had put their signatures, all the ministerial level conference. And the GSTP already provides it. That is now, of course, in the archives somewhere in the UNCTAD or the South Center, I don't know where. But that instrument is very much there. It is not as if when we talk of an alternative, we are talking something just dreaming about it. We had worked out a protocol, entire international agreement, and that agreement was also consistent with the discipline of GATT. Whatever freedoms we had in GATT, we had molded them in such a manner that this couldn't be questioned. We need some such exercise now, some such international initiative. And India is, for various reasons, best equipped to do it. We need it and we have the capacity to do it. But we have to free ourselves from the technical tasks. Technical tasks are important, but technical tasks have to be yoked to a political task. And that political task is a much wider political task. And I think if today's situation tells us something, it tells us that let us think anew in this matter. Let us let us work out the elements of such a discipline, a new discipline on the agrarian economy, the world as a whole, which will solve the problems, not add to the problems, which will not fill the pockets of the agribusiness, but which will make the ordinary farmer dependent on subsistence agriculture more better off. So that kind of a deal, and also in the process will ensure the national and regional food security, and in fact going beyond food security, food sovereignty. This is not the time to talk about that kind of a approach in detail, but I think I have done more than enough in mentioning to you my angst about the kind of things that have happened and my hope and dream about what still we can do in order to put the entire process on a different kind of a keel. Thank you very much.